right, I'm gonna.
Welcome to the Possibility Action Network podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Middleton, AKA Possibilityman. We're committed to bringing you guests who strive to better people's lives and serve as a force for good in the world. Today, our guest is Dr. Eleanor Hooks. She is the founder of the Smart Change Group, an executive coaching and consulting firm. She is the author of 6 books, with her 7th book on the way this year in 2022. She has expertise in working with corporate executives, focusing on team development, designing training modules, and also assisting them in making transitions to various roles in the corporate world. Her brand includes innovation, creativity, promoting intercultural understanding, and excellence. Eleanor Hooks, welcome to the show today.
My goodness, I'm really excited to be here. Stephen, I really support what you're doing because it's all about making a difference in the world and leading with possibilities.
Oh, wonderful.
With that positive intelligence notion.
Oh.
I'm really excited to be here and to have this conversation with you.
That's wonderful. Thank you for saying that. Hey, look, I'm really curious. You've done a great deal in your life up to now, and you're still actively doing other things. I want to take you back to when you were, let's say, in high school and college. Did you have this type of vision for your life and for yourself back then?
Well, actually, as you well know, our life takes us along many different paths. But it's interesting how there's sort of a theme. Today we call them memes, but there's sort of a theme in your life story. So very early on, when I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, I decided that I wanted to do something to help people, especially around their mental condition, wow, their sense of belonging in the world and that sort of thing. So the first thing that came to mind for me was, I'll go work in prisons as a criminologist. Now this is at age 9. And of course, my mother was horrified that I would want to do that. She really wanted me to go into a different field. But it's interesting because throughout my life, I have continued to look at opportunities to work with people who are stuck in some way, who for some reason, whether it's a team in a corporation or it's an individual, I'm always interested in this idea that there's so many possibilities for people. And for some reason they get stuck in some place. And so I got really curious about why was that? What was going on there? What was happening? And what could move them forward? So that's been kind of the theme for what I do, even in my writing. That's pretty much a theme.
Wow, that's interesting. So let me probe this a little more, because you're telling me is that you had this intuition, in a sense, since you were just a child. Where do you think this thing comes from, this intuitive sense of knowing?
Well, I have the sense that we are sort of born with a certain innocence and a certain degree of compassion. And unfortunately, for some of us, we get layered as we go through life with a different kind of theme or a different kind of sense of what needs to happen in the world. And we get more individualized rather than having more of a sense of community. But I really believe that we're born really innocent.
Wow.
And joyful, and we have this inborn compassion, and that certainly DNA and our early life experience have some impact on what happens next.
Yeah.
But I do think, and incidentally, when I encounter people who are having great difficulty, whether they're, people who are on TV, on the news, or they're people I'm actually working with, I really try to see the innocence in them, to look very deeply at what's going on for them.
Yeah.
Not in terms of what they're currently doing or not doing, but more in terms of what were they like when they were 5?
Wow.
What were they like when they were 2 years old?
Yeah. Yeah.
And, then I get to imagine what the possibilities are there.
Wow, that's fantastic. I love that. And I like the way you expressed that, is that we come into this world, as blank slates. And then you said we get layered.
Yes.
I've never heard that before, layered.
Yes.
So in a sense, then, our natural innocence and capacity gets covered up by society. Yeah.
Exactly. In fact, really kind of a fun story. I was invited to Washington, D.C., this was many years ago, to meet a woman who was billed as a real guru for women, women's rights and needs, etc. And she was from India. So she came, and for some reason, I can't remember her name, but I do remember that I was invited by, a teacher at the Gestalt Institute whom I really admired. So she said, come, and I said, okay, I'm there. So I went to hear this woman. She had some really great pearls of wisdom about women and what women need to do as a community. But this one story she told, or actually is kind of a metaphor that she used, was about the fact that women go through life, and I would say everyone goes through life. And every time they meet someone, there's a little bit of that person that gets plastered onto them.
Wow.
And that whether they meet someone who really, serves their interests or not, someone who really appreciates and respects them or not, all of that gets sort of layered, literally, on top of them. And then one day they look into the mirror and they don't recognize themselves.
Wow.
And that stayed with me for years. The idea that this interaction with people has some benefits. Obviously, we want to engage with people. But then the downside of that is, what do we take on and allow to be layered onto us?
Right, understood. I get you. I love that. I mean, use that phrase, layered. But look, I want to probe this just a little bit more, because in hearing you, and correct me if this is not where you're going with this, but it seems as if when a person is born into the world, there's something else here beyond the person's, let's call it, skin line.
Yes.
I don't know what to call it, maybe the soul or spirit, I don't know what to call it, but is that presence always with us in the background?
Yes. Yes. And it's, we talk about that essence. Howard Thurman, someone I really admired, talked about centering down and getting in touch with that internal spirit that sits there.
Wow.
People have different ideas about what that is. No one can really define it very, very well. It's almost, and this is a real departure, I'm kind of nerdy when it comes to quantum physics and quarks and stuff like that. Okay. And one of the things we know about quarks, which is that very tiny element, is that we don't really know that they exist except when they've already moved to another spot. So it's almost like I only know something on the basis of what it has already done or where it has already been. Yeah. So where I'm going with that is that in terms of that internal spirit, We only know by the effects of it.
Mm-hmm.
So things will happen in my life. Let's kind of boil it down to something very simple. If you think about someone you haven't thought about for a long time, and then the phone rings.
Mm-hmm.
Now we call that, we call it serendipity or coincidence or something like that. But to me, it is evidence that something is moving in the universe.
Yeah.
We don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And we're participating. We're not just bystanders.
Mm.
We are participating in that.
Yeah.
So that's exciting because it says, not only is there this essence that's inside of me, I can center down and really get connected with that, but there's all that's outside of me that I have access to as well.
Yeah.
That's really powerful.
That's powerful indeed. And that's encouraging, because I'm gathering from you is that because of this presence that's always here, that we can be guided and inspired. So I want to ask you, looking at your professional career, your colleges you've gone to, the professional programs, the certificate programs, do you feel that your life has been guided in making those choices of, graduate school, for example? Can you tell us about that and whether you felt that were guided when you make those choices?
Yes, in terms of a graduate school specifically, and I'll start with my doctorate degree and kind of work backwards. But with that, it was this gnawing kind of sense that I needed to know more. I needed to understand more. I needed to be involved more in the idea of intercultural communication. Because at that point, I was actually working in a public school system, and the population was quite diverse. And I didn't really have a sense that there was a real understanding of all the differences that were showing up, and that many people were being invited to assimilate rather than acculturate or to bring their own perspective, And I didn't think that the people I managed or supervised, who were counselors, were really positioned to do anything about that, in terms of their knowledge base. So that really catapulted me into a doctoral program. It's like, I've got to study this. I've got to figure out what this is and what some practical applications might be of this. So that's what really kind of drove me into that. That's been kind of a theme for me, because in counseling, I had a very negative experience of counseling in high school. And I went to a college prep high school, kind of, a gem in Philadelphia. And yet I encountered someone who discriminated against me. And so I decided, it was very clear, the discrimination. And so I decided that I needed to go into a profession where I could protect people from that I could be a different kind of counselor, right? So that sort of drove me into that. So there's always been this sense that, people have needs, but they also have possibilities. And opportunities, and how can they take what is, everything from trauma to, a slight of some sort, or, being discounted. We could go on with the whole list. Whatever it is, there's always an opportunity for them to do something, because because of, what we just discussed in terms of the broad possibilities in this whole universe. So the key is, how do we discover that? And it's not out there, it's in here. So that's a starting place.
Yeah.
And then all that's out there that we were just talking about comes to our aid. I believe the universe is for us, not against us.
Okay. Okay. So looking at this, and you've studied this as an academic and a writer and thinker, how are we doing as a world culture? I want to put it that way, as a one world culture. How are we doing in terms of intercultural understanding?
I think that we're growing. We're growing and we're expanding and we're evolving. And if you think about growth, growth is, it's not necessarily comfortable all the time. You know, if we think about even like a basic plant, you know, we put some seeds in the ground, it has to push through, and it's kind of messy at first. And we put fertilizer down, and all kinds of growth kinds of things. We throw that in, and I think a lot of that is happening around the world. A lot is being put into the soil.
Yeah.
But the growth process is not. It is continual, but it is not necessarily neat and neatly packaged. So what happens is there's a lot of pushing through, and it's messy. And what happens is that ultimately we'll see the fruits of it. But like any other growth, I mean, something will come along and knock it down. And then that process starts all over again. So we're in this, from my perspective, we're in a cycle where there's a lot of growth. And when you have a lot of growth, there's a lot of energy. And some of that energy is fighting against other energy. Okay. Especially in terms, we as people, energy just is, but we're using our energy in different ways. Yeah. And as a result, we are looking at this and thinking, oh my goodness, this is a mess. Yeah. But I absolutely believe that the universe is perfectly unfolding. Wow. Perfectly.
Yeah, I like the way you put that, because it's what it says is that we are in let's say continuous expansion. Exactly. And expanding, there's going to be a little bit of mess along the way. So I like that. But you mentioned the word trauma. I've got to ask you this. I don't make it our focal, but so we know trauma is in the world for sure. But I want to ask you another question about it. Can people heal from their traumas in the plural sense? Do you feel that people can actually heal from that stuff?
I think it's possible, but I think, we humans like to rush things. So if there's trauma, let's just sit down, work this out, come up with a plan, and then we'll have it all done. That's not, trauma is very deep. And there are lots of, it's almost like there are lots of different players in this, in trauma. So often, if you think about traumatic experiences that, let's say, young children experience, and we could pick from a whole long list, whether it's, sexual assault or battery, all kinds of things. But the idea that that child who has been living with this for a while should suddenly just be able to work it out. Okay. That's unreasonable because it's been sitting there for a while. And as the child grows and gets, becomes an adult, that is sitting, it's almost like having old cheese in the refrigerator. Wow. Yeah. I don't want to, I hate to use such a mundane example, but it's old cheese. It's moldy, it's old, it's smelly, it's awful. And it's sitting there, but it's in the corner of the refrigerator.
Mm.
And, you know, it has affected that whole corner.
Yeah.
And in fact, when we open the refrigerator door, it has affected the whole refrigerator.
Right.
We need to have, in that case, the patience to meticulously clean out all of that energy. And it really is energy.
Yeah.
And that takes time. So that's one of the things that can be kind of heavy on us right now, because we think, oh my goodness, there are so many people who are traumatized by war, by, you know, famine, by floods, by, you know, earthquakes. I mean, you know, so the broad kind of trauma, and then the individual type of trauma, the family trauma, the community trauma, the identity community trauma. I mean, there are lots of different types. And so, yes, there is hope for trauma, but we have to give it time.
Sure.
We really do. And I think everybody is really kind of, you know, let's get it done. Let's clean this up. Let's get rid of it. You know, it's not good.
Yeah.
But easier said than done.
Yeah. That made me think about, you know, just the life experience of a human being. It seems that we can go from feeling safe, where we're safe, you know, all is well. Then we can get to a point of feeling unsafe. So is that what trauma is like? Is it like a balance between, okay, I'm safe, oh, something happens, oh, I'm not safe now. And then the opportunity is to try to go back to safety. Is that a part of the dynamics of healing from something that's traumatic?
I think I'm going to kind of jump ahead of that particular idea of safety. Well, yeah, I'll stay there first, and then I'll leave. We have, as part of our brain, this sense that we have to respond when we're under attack, right? I think the issue is that for some people, sometimes because of trauma and sometimes because of a whole host of other life events, people believe that they need to be vigilant at all times. And it wears down a person. We look at some of the violence against African Americans, you know. We can either look at that as, oh my gosh, I have to be ready at all times. And to a certain degree, you do. You know, at a certain level, you do have to be ready. So that reptilian brain that we talked about, that the part of the brain that is kind of on alert in case you are, in case there's danger, sometimes we begin to use that more than is necessary. And we don't use the part of the brain in concert with this, incidentally. They aren't just like separate entities, they work together. The other part of the brain that is a lot more, let's call it logical, where it's really assessing everything that's going on. Now, if you've ever gone through any kind of assessment, it takes a while, right? And so that's what happens with that part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. It starts processing, but it's a little slower than this part of the brain that's designed to protect us in the event of imminent danger, right? So what we want to do is have both parts of this brain, the whole brain, kind of working together so that we can make wise decisions about what's going on for us.
Okay.
But I think what happens is that, you know, when we have systemic issues that are happening, the part of the brain that is more frightened, fearful, on alert, portion is going to be activated so much more. So if you're living in a community that is continually under attack, it makes sense to protect yourself, to be on high alert. If you're in a community, and I'm talking about even living in a community where that is not the case, then obviously you're going to be a whole lot calmer. It's really logical. It is the way things are going to be. And to expect that people in communities that are under attack, literally under attack, and I don't mean attack only by, law enforcement, that sort of thing. I'm talking about an attack based on food insecurity or housing issues. Just broadly speaking, poverty. All of those, that's an attack on people. All of those are attacks on people. I said to someone with regard to poverty, I said to someone the other day that the main issue with poor people, a group that we call poor people, is that they have no money. It is not that there's some other, nefarious kind of explanation for why they are poor. They are poor because they have no money. People are without a home. We call them homeless, but they're without a home. That's what makes them homeless. You put them in a home and they're no longer home. And I don't mean to just reduce this to something that is just a rational, logical kind of piece, but I think it helps us to go to the smallest element of something, to understand what's really going on. And then we begin to look at all of the different ways that this very elementary problem has mushroomed into something that is very, very complicated.
Right. I understand that. Yeah. Okay, I want to stay with this kind of theme to glean more about what you've learned. So what have you learned from life and from your professional career about healing and resilience?
I think resilience is not necessarily being totally optimistic all the time, but having hope that the future is going to be different from the present. And therefore, being open and allowing for opportunities to arise. So it's not, so often we talk about, oh, you just got to work hard, work hard, work hard. There are many people who are working very, very hard. Okay. And yet they feel as if they're just, they're on a treadmill, just walking in place. They're not really, nothing new is happening for them. And resilience for me is looking at a situation that may be a horrible situation and seeing the opportunity in that. Seeing that there's something that's beneficial about it. And sometimes that's difficult. That is really difficult. So I have to, in order to talk about resilience, I also have to go back to this whole universal idea of how everything kind of fits together. How if you believe that everything is perfectly unfolding, then you really have hope. And with that hope, you can put plans into place. You can try new things. You can say, I'm not going to allow this event or this condition to really be kind of the signature for my life. I'm going to move forward. And that's an element of resilience. It's being able to literally bounce back.
Okay.
And so resilience, yes, but I believe that that's possible for anyone if they know how well, let's just say it's not only an individual experience, resilience.
Mhm.
I think it requires support from other people.
Mhm.
I think part of the I would say the world concerns
Mhm.
is that people look like they're in communities, but they aren't necessarily in healthy communities.
Mhm.
They're in groups.
Mhm.
They may be in cultural groups or religious groups.
Mhm.
But if you look into the internal workings of the groups,
Mhm.
there isn't the sense of Ubuntu, which is an
Yeah.
African expression of community. There isn't that real spirit of community.
Mhm.
And it's possible. It's
Yeah.
not that, this is an odd idea.
Yeah.
We have all kinds of patterns for it,
Mhm.
models for it.
Yeah.
And I think when people are in a community, they have a certain degree of support, and that is a boost to their resilience.
Mm.
Resilience is internal,
Mm.
but the community supports that and keeps it going,
Yeah.
sustains it.
Yeah. I get that. That's great. I love the phrase bounce back. I felt it when you said it,
Yeah.
bounce back. We have that capacity. Now, let's continue on with this theme in terms of what you've learned, as a thinker, a practitioner about compassion and forgiveness. What have you learned? What has life taught you about those ideas?
Oh, compassion is a beautiful thing, first of all. But compassion starts, if you really want a firm footing on compassion, it starts with the individual. It starts with the self. And, whether you're using, like the 10 Commandments
Mhm.
or the Sermon on the Mount or Buddhist principles, it's all about how do you relate to other people? How do you see yourself in other people? How do you treat other people with respect, with love, with kindness, with generosity? In Buddhist principles, I love the way it sort of reduces everything to, just lists and patterns and that sort of thing. And there's one of the teachings is around what they call the three poisons.
Mm.
Three poisons are hatred, and we see that all the time. And the next one is greed. And the third poison is delusion. So when we see all of those operating, that causes a lot of turmoil and a lot of hurt in the world. And so one of the things when I think about compassion is that instead of hatred, the obvious is love,
Mm.
loving kindness. With greed, the obvious antidote, what I'm talking about is the antidote. The antidote to greed is generosity.
Mm.
How can you be more generous?
Mm.
And the delusion is the one that's real, for me, from my perspective, is really tough. Because the idea is that people need to understand that everything changes.
Mm.
Everything changes. So when I dig in for something, if I dig in for a moment, it has changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so now I'm holding on, I'm attached to something that doesn't really exist anymore.
Mm.
That's so much of what happens in terms of culture. Culture is in part, it's very supportive. It does create communities, all of that good stuff, but it also just digs in. And so the world changes. And when I talk about culture, it's not just race as a culture. I mean, any group of people who come together around some kind of central ideas, that to me is the basis for a culture. Now, culture takes on a lot of different textures, but a culture digs in.
Yeah.
And the world keeps moving.
Right.
And so so then, because there's this great attachment to the belief or the movement or the group or the community, then there's difficulty when you see something else happening. And, there's this turning away. It's like, no, I don't want that. And the minute you do that, you create resistance. So then you have all of, then it gets complicated. Remember I said, just growth, it's just going to happen, it's pushing through, et cetera. But then it gets complicated with all these layers.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So delusion is removing this idea that things are permanent. We're not permanent. The world is not permanent. Anything that we see, it may look solid to us, but it's not. When I say it looks solid, in the sense that, have you ever, gotten a chair, just a simple chair, really comfortable chair, and over the years, the arms wear a little bit, or it's not as firm as it used to be. The pillows are a little smashed in or something like that, and then you look at the chair and you remember when you first got the chair, none of these things were issues. But because you were comfortable in the chair, you didn't notice until one day you say, oh, I need a new chair, right? So that's what happens when people get stuck. It's a comfortable chair. It's a comfortable place to be. And we don't notice that it's changing.
Wow, that's interesting. So, you've talked about, and no doubt written about, present awareness. I hope I got that right. And just for a minute, and I want you to talk about that with us. But let me contextualize it by saying, it seems to me that you've joined people like Eckhart Tolle, Michael Singer, and some of the other popular writers, who talk about the present moment, or now, that kind of thing. So can you tell us about what you're trying to do when you share or write about present awareness, and how you may even connect with some of these other teachers?
Well, for me, it's kind of basic, the present awareness focus, because from my perspective, the present is the only thing that's really real. I just mentioned the idea of we think a chair is solid, like it's not going to change. The present moment is really all that we have. It's all that we have. The future, we have no idea what the future is going to look like. I mean, we can make, very elaborate plans. Those plans will change. And if we go back to the past, sometimes they say the past really doesn't exist. Our emotions about the past exist. Sometimes we see evidence, whether it's our body, like our eyes, our body in some way, our hearing, our speech, all kinds of things. We notice these changes, right? And that's what's happening for us right now. But if we go back to the past, none of that is really available to us. It's gone. And so often the past really doesn't have any more to tell us, even if we go back looking. There's not a lot there that we can really pick up. and use.
Mhm.
So what is most accessible to us and valuable to us is what's going on right now. And the magic of right now is that even as I say it, a new now is available, right?
Yeah.
So it's the idea of just, this whole idea of just being tapped into the flow.
Mm.
And that when you are tapped in, when you're tuned in to the flow that is existing in the present moment, then you're prepared for the next moment.
Mm.
I think the other piece around the present moment is that in the present moment is really where the wealth, where the abundance, where the possibilities are.
Mm.
And I think the real value is to simply sit still,
Wow.
to just be still, because we miss moments.
Yeah.
We're busy.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I love Tagore's quote, says something like, nature does not hurry, and yet everything is accomplished.
Mm.
So you look at a tree, it's just steadily doing what it's doing. It's being a tree. And that's also part of the present moment, to just be who you are. And from my perspective, we're love incarnate. That's really what we are.
Okay.
We're love in a body.
Mm.
And if we are that,
Yeah.
and if we just sit still for a moment and really get present with that, it prepares us for all sorts of things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a lot. And I'm just thinking about someone who may be listening to this podcast or watching it on one of the platforms where it'll be. And I can hear them asking, well, wait a minute, well, how do you disconnect from those stories that keep coming up from this past that doesn't exist? So can you talk with us a little bit about that?
Well, I like the term story because let's say we're watching, let me give you an example. We're watching TV. We're watching, let's say even a medical show, okay? And my favorites, I love medical shows, but anyway, you're watching the medical show, and at the end of this week's episode, let's say it's something that comes on every week, and at the end of the episode, are parts of that episode real to you, or are they stories? And so, and I put it that way because, they're dealing with some things very often that are real in terms of their representations of what happens for people in in emergency rooms usually. But is that a story? Of course it's a story. Somebody wrote it. They use the expertise of medical consultants, to get some accuracy there in terms of treatments, et cetera, and terminology, but it's a story. But we're very engaged in this story. We get really excited. Oh yeah, my favorite show is on. Let me sit down and settle in, it's a story. Yeah. There's no reason, but here's the real, kind of edge in all of this, is that the story generates certain emotions. So either we're excited, or we're wondering how they're going to figure out how to heal this person, how to, come up with the best treatment for this person. And I'm still in the medical show. Or we get, we wonder if this particular doctor is going to stick to protocol, or is he going to veer off into something more, creative or whatever. So we're excited, we're engaged, etc. But we have all these emotions that are coming up, fear, anxiety, hopefulness. I mean, all kinds of stuff going on.
Mhm.
Well, the same is true with our life stories that exist in the past. We have emotions. So what we remember about those events in the past is really at an emotional level. The facts get blurrier and blurrier as time goes on. Certain things really kind of get triggered sometimes because they're kind of sitting there. We haven't worked through that. Perhaps we were too young to even know what it was. And
Mm.
so it sits there, it's very unclear. We don't know what it is. And so it gets triggered. Or maybe there was a lot of pain that gets triggered. So what we're remembering is the pain.
Mm.
And it gets triggered because we're facing a new pain. And we need to figure out how those are connected. All of this is going on in our mind.
Mm. Mm.
All of this is going on in our mind and in our heart.
Yeah.
So that's the deal in terms of the present moment. Staying in the present moment is here is the beautiful nature of sitting still,
Mm.
whether it's in meditation or prayer, contemplative prayer, whatever you want to do. Sometimes it's just sitting still,
Mm.
is that, and breathing and paying attention to your breathing is a way for you to get grounded in your body.
Mm.
Because the body is like a sense laboratory, you know? And so if you get grounded in your body, when you breathe, you really pay attention to how you're actually feeling, and you begin to understand how you can be at peace, how you
Mm.
can find calm, even in the midst of a lot of turmoil,
Mm.
and even in the midst of a lot of negative thoughts.
Mm.
All of that's possible.
Wow. Okay. Look, I want to look at your business a little longer, or just a few more, if you have more time, just a
Yeah,
couple of
yeah.
questions about your business. As I was looking over the Smart Change group, I saw something that I would equate to a brand promise. Now, maybe that's not your intention, but it seems to me, if I were to articulate it, it would be that your brand promise includes something like smart change, right time, something like that. How did you come up with that type of promise, for potential clients?
Yeah, it's interesting. I especially working with corporate clients,
Mm.
but actually it has kind of spread to just about everything I do. And that is, there's a certain timing for everything. Uh, Even you probably saw my website, do a thing at its time and peace follows it.
Mm.
And I think there is very often in corporations a rush to do something
Yeah.
without really understanding the timing. And it's not just time itself, it is the idea that if you want to move a team forward in terms of a new initiative, you really want most of the people, if not all of the people, to buy into it,
Mm.
buy into the change.
Mm.
But people adopt or adapt to a change at different speeds.
Yeah.
So let me give you an example, and not even a change initiative, but it's probably not a good idea to initiate a major recruitment of new people into an organization when you're laying off people.
Mm. Okay.
It sounds like, who would do that?
Yeah.
But there really are companies who do that.
Mm.
They are bringing in people and they're pushing people out. And and you think, this is probably not the right time.
Yeah. Mm.
Or, I mean, and all sorts of things can happen in organizations and leaders don't necessarily consider the timing of it. So my sense is that we want to make the right change that involves a whole series of different ideas at the right time. When you put those two together, then you probably will have a successful initiative moving forward.
Yeah. Well, that's so important, not only for corporations, but for people. So let me ask you.
Absolutely.
You said people move and corporate leaders move at different speeds. So how do you manage it when people are at different speeds and they want to slow down, they can't slow? How do you manage that?
I think, and this is where coaching comes in for me.
Okay.
And my background in Gestalt work is just so helpful, because one of the things I used to enjoy even through the training in Gestalt was the idea of pointing out contradictory kinds of events. Someone who, let's see if I can find an example, like someone who thinks that everyone should be given a voice on a team, like we really want everybody to be engaged, but the leader of the team does all the talking. So it's like, wait a minute, that's really, that doesn't really work. So in terms of leaders and managers really understanding that everybody needs to be involved in order for the outcomes to be what you want them to be. Sometimes you have to point out in their history, this is probably the only time that the past really works. Let's look at what happened last year when you tried to initiate something and it didn't work out. Okay, so what happened? Where did you slip? An African proverb says, don't look at where you fell, look at where you slipped.
That's good. I like it.
So you slipped at some point. What happened? In project management, it's so important not only to define the problem, but to be clear about the process. Does the process really answer the defined problem, or does it go off on some other tangent, or get so buried in details that it doesn't really address the issue? Or have you, so often in project management, when I've spoken with people who are involved in a project, they are concerned that not everybody is really pulling their load. They're not, accountable, or they lose interest in it because it gets so detailed. There's so much that has to be done that by the time people wade through it, they want to do something else. It's like, can we do this in a different way? So, those are just a couple of examples that I've encountered. But my point is that pointing out contrasts, pointing out, what they've learned or perhaps not learned as well from past behaviors. But also, and the most powerful, is pointing out the contrasts and the behaviors in the present.
Wow.
So what's happening right now? What are you doing right now? You're doing all the talking, and you want other people to, brainstorm or give their perspectives, but they have no airtime.
Yeah. Wow. Got it. Well, that's great. Hey, look, before we part, I got to ask you about your books. Look, you've written 6 books already, and you're writing your 7th book this year, completing your 7th book. First, what do you try to convey in your book? What was your favorite book project? And what are you currently trying to convey in your writing today?
Oh, well, as I mentioned, the theme is around helping people to see possibilities, to see opportunities, particularly opportunities in the present moment, which is for me where it all starts. In terms of my favorite book thus far, believe it or not, is African Zen.
Ah,
I love African Zen because, first of all, it introduces the idea of African proverbs being kind of an impetus for wisdom and for spiritual wisdom in particular. And so I like the, sort of the underlying intention around that. And so that's part of the reason I like that. With Daily Sip, that was Daily Sip of Joy and Peace. That was a mammoth undertaking. It is just a really big book. I think that in that book, again, I really press this idea of being in the present moment. And also the idea of my 9 principles for a joyful life, which are very important around our relationship with spirit and, being kind to ourselves and others and so on. And with, other books, my poetry book, my other book in many cases, I wanted to be brief. So my early books were, kind of pithy and witty expressions and those kinds of things. And then, powerful quotes for people to guide people. Then with my poetry book, I wanted to deal with the whole idea of attachments, clinging to certain aspects of our lives, exploring what it means to live in the presence. The presence is another word that I use for, God, the universe, spirit, and including a poem about doubt. So I explored the whole landscape of living. They were reflections that I had on living in the presence. But my latest book has to do with my recent bout with cancer. And I'll tell you, in all of this, I began in all my writing, at some level, I was dealing with the idea of suffering. What is suffering all about? I sort of, kind of poked at it here and there. And, my remedy was, stay in the present. And then I was diagnosed with cancer. And I thought, gee, this is probably the best opportunity that I've ever had to really know what suffering is. And it goes back to my Gestalt experience, which is all about experience. It's an experiential piece. And so having cancer for me from the very beginning, even, early on with treatment, et cetera, I was basically putting into practice this idea of being still. And I'll give you an example. I won't go into anything graphic, but I do describe this in my upcoming book. The idea that when you have radiation, especially since I had throat cancer, when you have radiation, and they actually, the radiology technicians actually create a mask that they put over your face. And in order to do that, they take this material, I have no idea, I think it's some kind of, plastic or whatever material, but it's wet. They put it on your face and mold it to your face. And then they have this flange that, goes a little beyond your face. and down on your chest. And it has holes in it, so it looks like a net. And so you lie there the first time they do it because it has to harden. And then you come back for your first treatment and they bolt you down to the table with this mask on you. And you have to lie there for usually about 15, maybe 20 minutes while they're shooting the radiation into you. Now, there are many people, I'm certain, who would freak out at having, to be bolted down flat on a table, unable to move at all. For me, the first thing that came up was great compassion for the people who are claustrophobic, who are frightened beyond belief at what is happening, realizing that these, very powerful rays are being shot into their body. Okay. So that's the compassion piece. And then when the first treatment, I went into deep meditation.
Wow.
So while I'm lying on the table, and you can still breathe, so I was breathing deeply. I got very, very still. And of course, I couldn't move. So I really kind of saw that as an opportunity to be still, to be present, to feel whole, to really go to center down, going back to Howard, to really center down and get into this really calm place. And then coming out of that, when they unbolted me and the whole thing, I realized that there are people working in these facilities. And keep in mind, this was at the height of the COVID pandemic, the early part that this was happening. And I realized that these people are, moving into these areas where, the virus is raging. They don't know what people are coming into the facility with, we tried to manage that, but, so that was an issue. But then also just the work that they're doing, they realize what they're doing to your body, right? So I made it my business. I mean, every single day, I thank them.
Wow.
I thank you so much. Thank you became almost a mantra for me during the whole experience. And the thank you was not only thank you for helping me to get through this and possibly heal, but also thank you for what you're having to experience as well, and you're willing to do it on my behalf.
Wow.
And then, of course, as I'm leaving, have a great day. And, because I wanted them to know I recognize that their day is not necessarily the most pleasant.
Wow.
So the key is, it's compassion and love and kindness and all of those great things are not just words. They're not just theories. You really can put it into practice.
Wow. Well, just listening to you, Eleanor, is a meditation. That experience. Yeah. Well, look, thank you so much for being with us today. This really was a very good, enjoyable for me. So.
Oh, well, it was enjoyable for me too. I love the Q&A approach. I really do. That's really my favorite.
That's great.
So, it was pleasant. It was also great to connect with you again.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, well, you have been listening to the Possibility Action Network podcast. Our guest today is Eleanor Hooks. And you'll find this on several podcast platforms. Oh, Eleanor, before you leave, let me ask you one last question. Would you mind sending me titles of your books, and so that I can put it in the description where I post this podcast?
Yes, I will.
Fantastic. Thank you again. Okay.
All right. Thank you. All right. Take care.
Yeah.